Hi, and welcome latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And Chris, here we are, a brand new academic year, just started recently. And here at the podcast, History You Didn't Know But Should, we've been looking sort of back on some of our past episodes and revisiting some of the things we've covered in the past. I think one of our more recent episodes was on the lost colony and looking at some of the newest evidence that has come out on the lost colony. And look, I would encourage our listeners to go do their own research because there has been some exciting developments on the lost colony. But that leads us to our topic today, Chris, and that is sort of fresh perspectives on history, different ways to view history. The need, I think you said when we were going over this, Chris, the need to have fresh eyes on things sometimes. And it's so this is one of those things that sort of frustrates me. I hear people say, well, history never changes. Your class has got to be interesting, easy to teach because history never changes. And I'm like, history changes every single day.
Yeah, it changes, and the problem is that sometimes I think we're just so stuck in the past. I was cleaning out, one of our classrooms in the building the other day, and I noticed there were all of these textbooks that were lining a bookshelf. And as I looked at all of these textbooks, I went back and I opened the copyright and I saw that some were from 1970, some were from 1990, some were from, I think the latest one might have been 2004. And I flipped through them and I started seeing that the chapters were different, but the information was still the same in that there were short blurbs about the Wright brothers. It was a short blurb about the Great Depression. But what I didn't see is a fresh perspective on things. And it just got me thinking with all of the advancement in technology, with all of the access that you and I and others have this day to research, you know that there needs to be a fresh perspective on things. We need to re-examine. And some people will call this, I don't want to get too down deep in the woods of this, but some people will call it like revisionist history, kind of the re-examination or possibly even reinterpretation of historical events. And what that basically means is people will sometimes challenge the old way of thinking. Why did this happen? And I'm not necessarily saying that we challenge it, but that we look at it with fresh eyes. And I think when we do that, that we start to see that there's some unique things that maybe we overlooked, and maybe some things that we didn't see because we studied in a textbook which just had 5 sentences on a particular big event.
Yeah, you talk about the reinterpretation of history. I like that. And I think sometimes it is viewed as a negative, as you mentioned, but it's necessary for the field of history. It's necessary for the historian. It's necessary to do justice to history because the more information we gather, the more information we learn, whether it's through historians examining documents, reading letters, through archaeological discoveries and things like that. The more we get from that, the more it doesn't. I don't. Maybe sometimes it changes, but I think sometimes it either refocuses or sharpens the focus on history. And Chris, my area of interest is really like that early American period, the early national period. And, so long it was the founders, the founders, the founders. And we talked about Alexander Hamilton and George Washington and John Jay and these people. And look, they deserve that focus, but they were not all of society. They did not represent what the colonies were necessarily, what America was in its early days necessarily. I mean, you've got to look, what was the role of women? What was the role of women in politics? They couldn't vote, they couldn't necessarily run for office, but what did their voices mean? What were they thinking? How did they influence their husbands and their sons and their brothers? Look at slaves. I know at Mount Vernon and also at Monticello, there's been a new focus on trying to understand the life of these slaves at these places. And that, of course, helps better understand what they were living through and how they viewed what was going on, especially at a place like Mount Vernon, where their master, so to speak, was, this big general, first president of the United States. How did they view him versus how did other people view him? So you're getting different perspectives, which is sort of creating a bigger picture, maybe, of these historical figures and events that I can understand why some people don't like that, I guess, but it is absolutely necessary for historians and for history to do that reevaluation, reinterpretation as things keep moving on.
Yeah, one of the things, and I like that as far as sharpening the perspective. And one of the things that I really like, and I wish I had the time, but you can go to the National Archives website and you can actually participate in writing history. They are asking for volunteers to be transcribers. And what they are doing is adding these digital collections of letters. There's all kinds of different topics, all kinds of different time periods and things like that. And what they're asking for the general public, you don't have to be a historian, you just be someone who loves history and love looking at it, is you go and you take one of those digitized artifacts, a letter that was written from person A to person B in 1800, and they need you to transcribe it, to try to read it and to translate it and to put it into a form that allows people to be able to read it and to understand it. And it's things like that you really can't get out of, no disrespect to math, but math is what math is. But history, you having an integral part of translating that letter and allowing to be a part of history making. And then, as you read it, it maybe brings your attention to something like you just mentioned, like, man, what about the women? We remember John Adams' wife who said, John, don't forget the ladies.
Mhm.
And that's, I'm thankful for like things such as Hamilton and these Broadway plays and these musicals and even these movies that have coming out, that though they may be historical fiction in some way, they still lead people to become interested in, okay, who were the Schuyler sisters? What role did they really have in the making of the colonies? What really was the relationship between Alexander Hamilton and, Aaron Burr? And you hear a song that kind of talks about a duel, and then you start saying, man, I want to know about a duel, and then I want to look at things. And so I think that it's history is one of those cool things nowadays. It used to be, as people would say, oh, that class must be easy to teach. Well, now it's fascinating because you're able to make it more hip, if you will, make it more relevant, especially with things going on in the world. And you say, I probably need to know something about that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the Hamilton production. One thing I have seen, what year did Hamilton come out?
It's 10
1617?
years. So it's the 10-year anniversary is this year, so 2015.
Wow, it's been that long. But one thing I have noticed since that production has come out and all I teach is American history and American government. But one of the things I have uh, l- noticed among students, young students specifically, is their interest in things like you said, like the Hamilton duel or other aspects of Hamilton's life that, students 20 years ago probably didn't know much about. But now because of that play and they're seeing it online and they're listening to the music, they're asking questions about this stuff. Who was Alexander Hamilton? Where did he come from? What was his view of this? Why couldn't he and Burr, just move on? And it creates more questions for them, and going back to what I was talking about earlier with the reinterpretation of history, sometimes it's that fresh set of eyes, that young mind that asks a question the old crusty historians had never asked. Or maybe it's not a question they had never asked. Maybe it's this young person coming at it from a different perspective and being able to, as they look into the actual history, not the play so much, but as they look into, who was this Alexander Hamilton, and they start reading and they start researching, which they do, by the way, they can sort of stumble sometimes among not necessarily new ideas about it, but maybe taking a slightly different twist on it. And I think that that is a good thing. I know, Chris, I mentioned the Lost Colony. This past week, I did an entire class on the Lost Colony, which I've never done before. I've always mentioned it, move on. But I did an entire class where we went over a lot of information. We read John White's or part of John White's journal. And then I gave them four questions. And the four questions weren't really right and wrong academic questions. The four questions were really trying to get them to take all of this evidence and to apply it. So
Mm.
it's just sort of trying to get them to give their own perspective. And for a lot of the students, it was something they enjoyed. I think it was something that challenged them to think about it. But there were a few students, Chris, who really struggled with it because it was in their mind there was a right answer and there was a wrong answer, and it's like the only wrong answer here is something ridiculous, aliens got them, or the earth swallowed them up and they turned into vampires or something, you know but what I was trying to challenge them to do was look at that primary source material and reach their own conclusions. In other words, be historians.
Yeah, and I think you see that in so many different ways, just as we mentioned, but not just in the reviewing of historical aspects, but just trying to figure out what's going on in society today. People are wanting to be engaged. I see civic participation increasing among our young people. They want to get involved. They want to have a say in, the election process. They want to have a say in the running of government or the bureaucratic red tape and things of that nature, right? They agree because the younger people today are action driven and they don't understand and why does it take so long to go from point A to point B? You should just go from point A to point B. And I think that we as a society need that. Yes, there need to be, guidelines, but it doesn't have to be this long drawn out perspective that you said crusty old historians and I'll say crusty old politicians,
Mm-hmm.
feel that there can be this, well, let's just go do it.
Mm-hmm.
This mentality of just go do it. And I think that makes a big difference because if you think about it, how did the Industrial Revolution start? It started because people just went and did it. If you think about, how did we make it through World War II? People just went and did it. American women went into factories and they started working on airplanes and rifles and things like that, things they had never done before. Why? They just went and did it because that's what the nation needed. We today just need to do it because our society is going in the wrong direction. That's not based on politics, not based on who's in office. It's just we've taken the wrong perspective on what we need to be as far as an active citizens group that is focusing on what the freedoms are that have been passed to us through history.
You know, I talk about that I teach American history and American government. And when I do American government, it's usually online. And one of the things I have going, and this is related to your point, Chris, one of the things I have them do is film a video of themselves talking about themselves, introducing themselves to their classmates, talking a little bit about what they're curious about in government, et cetera, et cetera. And that's one of the things you hear over and over again is why isn't government working? Why isn't it working? We see these people on TV yelling at each other, blah, blah, blah. But they want to know why isn't it working? And they want to know how is it supposed to work? What has broken down in their mind to why isn't it working? And I think as historians, as members of society, like you said, as politicians, there needs to be an answer to that question. And there needs to be more than just an answer, how do we fix this? How do we keep this ball rolling so that in 25, 30 years, there's still a ball to roll? If
Yeah,
that makes sense.
it does. It does. And so, hopefully what we've done today is maybe move the needle to those that listen to this podcast. And maybe they've just been sitting here kind of listening and saying, yeah, I like what those two guys talk about. I kind of get into that. But maybe it moves them to say, I've always been interested in, why did this happen in history? Or why is this happening in history? And, maybe I'll go and just look online. Maybe it's going and looking at National Archives, or maybe it's reaching out to us through the podcast, through emailing us, or chatting through the Facebook and Spotify and all the other places where you can find our podcast, and maybe offering a comment saying, "Hey, you guys mind helping me kind of wrestle with this aspect of history?" So I do hope that our listeners will be proactive in saying, hey, I want to get more involved in this history thing and maybe looking at it through a different perspective and with a different lens. And if that's you, we thank you and we invite you to join alongside of us as we continue to go down this road of just two guys talking about history you didn't know but should. And we appreciate you being devoted listeners and for looking or listening to our previous podcast, but also just being a subscriber. So I encourage you to find us. You can find us on all of the many different playlists that are out there, whether it's Apple or Spotify or YouTube or even Facebook. However it is that you find us, we encourage you to stay there. But also, would you just do us a favor and share with a friend, share with a colleague, and just kind of pass it on so that we, as a group of people, can make history fun again, if you will, and just have a good time with it. So, Ray, I appreciate all that you do for our podcast. I hope our listeners appreciate us having these conversations and really diving into the deep parts of history. And so go check us out and leave us a comment, leave us a follow, and we would greatly appreciate it. And so until next time, I'm Chris.
And
He's
I'm Ray.
all right. We'll talk to you soon. Have a great day.